The marriage certificate still exists, but no one talks about what followed. A brutal document, signed in Alabama, 1850, records something that should never have happened. A plantation owner marrying his own enslaved cook. Not out of love, not out of mercy, but as a bet. And within months of that wedding, the deaths began. Not one, not two, 13. 13 bodies buried under southern soil, and not a single one officially explained. You're not here by accident, because what you're about to hear was never meant to survive. This is not just a story about cruelty. This is a blueprint of power, humiliation, psychological domination, and something far darker. Because men like Jeremiah Aldrich didn't just control land. They controlled reality. And the moment you understand how, you won't see history the same way again. They told you slavery was about labor. That's the lie. It was about control. Total control. Control over identity, over body, over truth itself. And sometimes, when men reach that level of power, they stop seeing others as human entirely. They start experimenting, testing limits, pushing boundaries, not for profit, but for something much more dangerous. Amusement. The bet that changed everything wasn't made in public. It happened in a room full of men who believed they were untouchable. Men who had already done things no law could truly punish. And that night, after whiskey blurred the line between morality and madness, one idea was spoken out loud. What if you married her? Laughter followed, but not the kind of laughter you're thinking. This wasn't humor. It was hunger. The kind of hunger that comes from men who have everything and are still empty. Because once a man owns everything, the only thing left is to break something sacred. And marriage was sacred. So they turned it into a game, a test, a spectacle. Jeremiah Aldrich didn't hesitate. Because men like him don't feel hesitation. They feel opportunity. What followed wasn't just a wedding. It was a ritual of dominance, a message, a warning, and the beginning of something that would spiral far beyond control. Because there are forces you don't awaken lightly. And there are lines once crossed that don't just change history. They curse it. And Aldrich had just crossed one with a smile on his face. The plantation itself, Willowbrook, just 40 miles upriver from New Orleans, became a stage for a cruelty so calculated it stunned even the hardened minds of the antebellum South. Aldrich wasn't born into wealth. He was the son of a failed Kentucky tobacco farmer, a man who had nothing but ambition and a willingness to walk where others feared. He arrived in New Orleans in 1839, a city dripping with wealth, vice, and secrecy. The old Creole families looked down on him, a newcomer willing to touch the dirty edges of profit. The slave trade carried a stigma even in a land built on slavery, but Aldrich had no patience for social niceties. His morality was optional. His hunger was absolute. By 1840, he partnered with two desperate men, Marcus Devo, whose family plantation teetered on ruin, and Samuel Rochelle, a former ship captain whose losses to yellow fever and misfortune had made him ruthless. Together, they formed the Delta Trading Company, a shadow operation that thrived in the gaps between legality and chaos. They purchased escaped slaves, kidnapped free blacks, smuggled human lives from illegal ships. Their profits were obscene, but the true currency wasn't money. It was power, the power to manipulate life itself, to bend it to their whim. And as Aldrich rose in wealth, he began to crave more than plantations and profits. He craved control over stories, over reality itself. Every ledger, every transaction, every death was a brushstroke in a painting of terror only he could see in full. When he acquired Willowbrook, it wasn't just a home. It was a fortress, a laboratory, a stage. The mansion's grand halls and sprawling fields concealed horrors the local townspeople couldn't imagine. And in those halls, he rehearsed dominance in silence, testing, probing, marking the limits of what he could do to others without consequence. The marriage to Celeste, the enslaved cook, was only the beginning. To the outside world, it was a curiosity, a scandal. But to Aldrich, it was a demonstration, a display of control so complete that it would echo far beyond his plantation gates. Because when a man like Aldrich stakes his ego against another human being, it isn't about love, desire, or amusement alone. It's about legacy, about proving that no one, not law, not family, not morality, can touch him. And the deaths that followed, they were the shadow of that statement. Each one meticulously timed, each one leaving just enough ambiguity to terrify anyone who might question him. No one saw it coming. No one understood the machinery of calculated cruelty that had been set in motion. And yet, the signs were there, buried in plain sight. If you think you can watch this and remain detached, you're already part of the story. Because understanding this is dangerous. Do you feel that chill creeping over your mind? That whisper saying, "This is real. Hold on to it, because it's about to get darker." By the spring of 1843, the cracks in Aldrich's empire began to show, though no one outside his inner circle could see them. Federal marshals were sniffing along the Gulf Coast, investigating illegal slave trading routes. Shipping records were examined, escapees were interviewed, and whispers of the Delta Trading Company's operations reached ears that refused to stay silent. Inside Willowbrook, the tension was almost tangible. Aldrich called an emergency meeting with Devo and Rochelle in his study. A room lined with leather-bound books he couldn't read, portraits of ancestors who weren't his own staring down as silent witnesses. The air was thick with humidity and suspicion. Every man there knew their empire of human misery could collapse overnight. Devo, the youngest, panicked first. "We dissolve the partnership," he suggested, voice shaking. "Destroy all records. Disappear quietly before it's too late." Rochelle, older, experienced, cautious, proposed a slower, more measured retreat. Shift assets offshore, bide their time, wait until the investigation passed. Aldrich had other plans. A plan so cold, so meticulous, it revealed a darkness beyond mere greed. He would kill both men, not recklessly, methodically. Devo first, then Rochelle, leaving the scene to appear as if they had destroyed each other over money. And he would walk away the sole survivor, inheriting every asset, free from scrutiny. That night, the warehouse where they had operated for years became a stage for murder. Aldrich arrived early, pistol in coat, skinning knife hidden in boot, his mind calm, almost clinical. The men sat around the table, whiskey poured, ledger spread. Conversation drifted toward cash reserves, accounts, hidden locations, and Aldrich's eyes never left his prey. Then the violence erupted. A single shot, Devo fell backward, his life spilling across the floor, eyes wide with betrayal. Rochelle lunged, glass shards cutting deep, fury and survival intertwining. 10 minutes of chaos. The struggle tearing documents, shattering furniture, leaving blood trails on every surface. Aldrich fought with precision, ending Rochelle's life with a twisting blade to the stomach. Even as the older man gasped his final words, Aldrich dismissed them. My son knows everything. He'll come for you. Words ignored in the moment, but not forgotten. Aldrich then transformed the crime scene into a lie so precise it would fool authorities. Devo and Rochelle arranged as though they had attacked one another. Money scattered, defensive wounds faked, false witnesses prepared. Every detail curated for maximum credibility. The authorities, overwhelmed and complacent, accepted the stage story. Devo and Rochelle had killed each other, and Aldrich was the innocent bystander. Within days, the warehouse was demolished, erasing evidence, leaving Aldrich free to consolidate wealth and position himself as a respectable planter. But in his arrogance, he overlooked a critical truth. The families of the dead were still alive, watching, waiting, and patience in the hands of the wrong man could be the deadliest weapon. Aldrich believed himself untouchable. He had silenced the men who knew too much, erased the physical evidence, and woven a story so convincing even the authorities nodded in agreement. He walked through Willowbrook's grand halls with the air of a man untethered by conscience, counting the fortune he had seized. Nearly $40,000 at the time, a sum that would translate to over $1 million today. Every ledger, every shipment, every illicit transaction now belonged solely to him. But what Aldrich did not account for was the intelligence he had underestimated. Marcus Devo's younger brother, Philippe, had been quietly documenting everything. Every transaction, every smuggling route, every corrupt official who had taken a cut. Philippe had watched the murders unfold through the cracks of gossip, overheard whispers, and subtle cues that the official story ignored. He knew Aldrich had lied, and he knew the man's arrogance would be his undoing. At the same time, Samuel Rochelle's son, Henri, was quietly unraveling the financial threads his father had left behind. He combined the knowledge of maritime operations with a formal understanding of law and banking. By tracing transfers, examining accounts, and leveraging contacts in the banks of New Orleans, Henri could see the architecture of Aldrich's empire. Fragile, over-leveraged, dependent on risk, and built on greed. The two young men were not seeking immediate revenge. They were architects of inevitability. While Aldrich indulged in wealth, women, and his growing reputation, Philippe and Henri were calculating the perfect storm. They knew that a man like Aldrich, intoxicated by success and hubris, would eventually expose himself. They would not rush. They would wait. And when the time came, they would strike with precision. Meanwhile, the plantation itself became a theater of fear for those enslaved under Aldrich's control. The cook, Celeste, and other enslaved people witnessed a tyranny that was not just physical, but psychological. Aldrich's cruelty was measured, designed to instill obedience through terror, ensuring no one could imagine disobedience without consequence. Every order he gave, every command he barked, carried the weight of potential annihilation. It was in this environment that the seeds of paranoia took root. Aldrich began to suspect betrayal where none existed, questioning allies and employees alike, convinced that someone, somewhere, might be plotting against him. And yet, he remained blind to the storm forming outside the plantation walls. Two young men, armed not with weapons, but with knowledge, ready to dismantle everything he had built. Because knowledge, when wielded with patience and intent, is more lethal than any gun. And soon, Aldrich would learn that the shadows he thought he controlled had grown long enough to reach into every corner of his life. Philippe and Henry's plan unfolded silently, almost invisibly. Philippe immersed himself in the circles of Louisiana's planter elite, observing Aldrich in his natural habitat. The clubs, the soirees, the poker tables where fortunes were risked on a single hand. He noted habits, weaknesses, and insecurities. Every gesture, every word, every routine became data points in a map of Aldrich's vulnerabilities. Henri, from the shadows of banks and shipping offices, traced every dollar, every asset, every hidden account. He understood the legal and financial systems well enough to see where Aldrich's confidence had outpaced his caution. The brilliance of their conspiracy was in its patience. They did not need immediate justice. They needed certainty. Aldrich's own flaws, his greed, his arrogance, his need to dominate, were the weapons they would exploit. And they were preparing to strike in a way that would mirror his own methods. Deception, betrayal, and destruction disguised as legitimacy. Every night, as Aldrich slept behind the thick walls of Willowbrook, the young men sharpened their strategies. The shadows were no longer just the absence of light. They had become a presence, a force waiting for the right moment. And Aldrich, intoxicated with his illusions of control, would not see it coming until it was far too late. Because in the world of secrets, the most dangerous predators are not the ones who kill in a moment. They're the ones who wait. Do you feel the tension building? Hold that unease close, because the next revelation will strip away even more of the illusion of Aldrich's invincibility. Spring of 1845 arrived, and with it, the illusion of Willowbrook's perfection began to crumble, though Aldrich remained blissfully unaware. His plantation hummed with the rhythms of cotton production, the laughter of hired hands, and the whispered compliance of those he enslaved. But beneath the veneer of prosperity, unseen eyes were mapping every corner, every flaw, every secret corridor where his power felt absolute. Philippe and Henri had moved beyond observation. They had begun subtle infiltration. Philippe, with the charm inherited from his late brother, embedded himself among Aldrich's social acquaintances. He attended dinners, nodded at political discussions, and shared casual drinks, all while discreetly probing for weaknesses. Every story Aldrich boasted of, every alliance he formed, was cross-checked against ledgers, shipping records, and carefully gathered intelligence. Meanwhile, Henri was working in the background, using his knowledge of the banking system to manipulate the flow of Aldrich's wealth, testing vulnerabilities that would later become catastrophic. Inside Willowbrook, Aldrich's obsession with control had grown almost pathological. He scrutinized every movement, every whispered conversation, every glance. Even Celeste, whose life was bound to his whims, could sense the escalating paranoia. She watched as he punished minor transgressions with disproportionate cruelty, not out of necessity, but as a signal to all that defiance would be fatal. Yet, even in his obsessive control, he failed to notice the creeping tide gathering beyond the plantation walls. Two young men orchestrating his downfall with patience and precision. The air of Alabama in 1850 was thick with more than summer heat. Secrets festered, alliances formed in shadows, and reputations were carefully curated to mask the truth. Aldrich believed himself untouchable, his crimes buried beneath a facade of respectability. But every empire built on deceit carries the seeds of its own destruction. Philippe and Henri understood this principle as naturally as breathing. They knew that Aldrich's arrogance, his belief that he could outmaneuver any human challenge, would blind him to the forces quietly aligning against him. And so they waited, not with impatience, but with the cold, calculated awareness that time was their ally. Every gamble Aldrich made, every dollar he mismanaged, every foolish attempt at social domination only brought him closer to the point of collapse. Meanwhile, the plantation itself became an unintentional ally to the young man. Its corridors, its servants, its patterns of labor, all were predictable, all were exploitable. The stage was set. The predator had become complacent, unaware that his prey had grown cunning, invisible, and inexorably patient. Aldrich's world, built on control and terror, was about to be turned inside out. Feel that tension? Let it sink, because the next chapter reveals the first cracks in the armor of a man who believed himself invincible. By mid-1850, Aldrich's grip on Willowbrook was absolute. At least that is what he believed. He walked the halls of his mansion as if he owned not just the land, but the very air his workers breathed. Every room whispered obedience. Every servant bowed in fear or calculation. And yet, beneath the polished floors and polished manners, a different narrative was quietly taking shape. One that he could not see, one that would unravel his carefully constructed empire. Philippe Deveau had positioned himself perfectly within the social ecosystem of Louisiana's planter elite. His charm was effortless, his knowledge of Aldrich's habits almost instinctive. He knew which men could be swayed, which whispered truths could be planted, and which small manipulations would ripple into irreversible consequences. Henri, operating through banks, shipping offices, and legal loopholes, began subtly redirecting Aldrich's wealth, creating the illusion that luck still favored him while quietly undermining the very foundation of his empire. Each dollar Aldrich gambled, each investment he boasted about, was a thread in the snare being laid around him. Meanwhile, Aldrich's personal life had become a theater of cruelty and control. Celeste, his cook and unwilling bride, bore the weight of his domination daily. Her presence was both a symbol and a tool, a constant reminder of Aldrich's ability to manipulate, to possess, to dictate life and death. And yet, Celeste's silence concealed more than submission. It held the awareness of someone who had seen the cracks in his power. She watched as he spiraled further into obsession, punishing minor errors, trusting no one, yet oblivious to the greater threat approaching from the shadows. The plantation itself became a stage for psychological warfare. Aldrich used the threat of violence to maintain order, yet he did not realize that fear alone cannot sustain an empire when intellect and patience are arrayed against it. Philippe and Henri understood the subtle mechanics of manipulation better than he could ever imagine. A carefully placed rumor, a discreetly timed financial hiccup, a whispered suggestion of betrayal. Each move designed to destabilize, to erode, to dismantle the illusion of invincibility. And here lies the truth that few understand. The most dangerous enemy is not the one who strikes immediately, but the one who watches, waits, and knows the contours of your weaknesses better than you do. Aldrich's arrogance blinded him to a law older than men. That control is only as strong as the one who underestimates it. By the time he noticed the patterns, it would already be too late. Prepare yourself, because what comes next is where the carefully orchestrated descent into chaos begins. The first blow that will expose the cracks in Aldrich's empire and set the stage for a vengeance so precise it could only have been engineered by minds far sharper than his own. The summer of 1850 descended on Alabama with a heat so oppressive it seemed to press against every living thing. Yet it could not match the suffocating tension building inside Willowbrook. Aldrich, unaware of the forces converging against him, continued his relentless pursuit of control. Every ledger he inspected, every overseer he questioned, every servant he threatened, was an act of hubris, a belief that fear could protect him from consequences far beyond his imagining. Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle moved with quiet precision, unseen yet omnipresent. Philippe had begun planting seeds of doubt among Aldrich's closest associates. A whispered comment at the gentlemen's club, a careful suggestion about mismanaged accounts, small insinuations about debts that never existed, all designed to loosen the invisible threads holding Aldrich's world together. Henri simultaneously manipulated the financial currents. He rerouted small streams of cash, delayed shipments, and introduced discrepancies that seemed minor to an untrained eye, but cumulatively were enough to destabilize a fortune built on illusion and cruelty. Inside the mansion, Celeste's existence became both a mirror and shield. To Aldrich, she remained the docile cook he had claimed as property, a tool in his grotesque wager. But Celeste had begun to understand the rhythm of his paranoia, the cracks in his overconfidence, and the subtle ways in which the plantation structure could be leveraged against him. She observed more than he realized, absorbing patterns, noting weaknesses, and silently marking the moments when Aldrich's focus faltered. She had learned a truth that few ever grasp. The walls of power are only as strong as the blind obedience of those who surround it. Aldrich's arrogance continued to blind him. He boasted openly of his dealings, of the cleverness that had allowed him to eliminate partners and seize fortune. He never suspected that two young men, armed with intellect, patience, and the meticulous records of their murdered kin, were orchestrating a reckoning so inevitable that it might have seemed supernatural to anyone else. Every risk Aldrich took, every small victory he celebrated, was secretly strengthening the web of his impending downfall. And here is the first whisper of inevitability. Empires built on fear and greed are fragile, no matter how untouchable they seem. Aldrich was about to learn that patience is a weapon more deadly than any pistol, and that vengeance, carefully plotted, can move unseen through time, space, and even the bravest of hearts. Keep your mind alert, because what comes next will reveal the first deliberate misstep Aldrich cannot recover from. A moment where the illusion of control shatters and the quiet predators of Alabama step closer to claiming their due. The first cracks in Aldrich's empire appeared not with violence, but with subtle disruption. A shipment of cotton, meticulously timed to coincide with the peak market prices, vanished, delayed at a dock for reasons that seemed coincidental, yet were anything but. To Aldrich, it was an inconvenience, a minor irritation. To Philippe and Henri, it was the opening gambit, the first deliberate strike designed to make him doubt his own competence. Every delay, every financial anomaly, was a brushstroke painting a picture of decline, one that Aldrich refused to see until it was undeniable. Inside Willowbrook, the plantation's hierarchy began to destabilize. Overseers whispered about accounts that didn't add up, workers murmured about deliveries that never arrived, and even the most loyal servants sensed a tension that Aldrich could not suppress. He attempted to assert authority with louder threats and harsher punishments, but the psychological pattern had already shifted. Fear alone could no longer maintain order. Uncertainty had begun to take root. The cracks widened, imperceptible at first, like hairline fractures in stone, but growing with every passing day. Celeste, ever the silent observer, understood the unfolding strategy better than Aldrich could imagine. She saw the alignment of forces, the careful orchestration of manipulation. And yet, she remained outwardly compliant, a mask of submission hiding a mind calculating every possibility. She had learned that survival often requires patience, patience that can be weaponized in ways even the most cunning man cannot anticipate. Her role in the coming storm was unspoken but pivotal, a living lever against the very man who had thought he could dominate everything. Philippe and Henry's moves became increasingly audacious. Letters forged to appear as warnings from creditors, subtle manipulations of Aldrich's gambling debts, and carefully timed rumors about the loyalty of his closest allies began to sow distrust within the mansion's walls. Friends became enemies, allies became suspects, and Aldrich's sense of invincibility began to crumble. Every decision he made, every attempt to assert control, played directly into the pattern that the two young men had designed. The lesson is brutal and simple. Power built on cruelty and arrogance is never secure. The more you rely on fear and domination, the more you blind yourself to the slow, inevitable erosion from forces that think and wait while you act recklessly. Aldrich was about to face a psychological siege, one that would strip him of certainty, confidence, and ultimately, the illusion of control. Prepare yourself, because in the next section, the first real confrontation will begin. A calculated strike that will force Aldrich into a position he cannot escape and reveal just how vulnerable a man can become when he underestimates those he thought powerless. By late 1850, Willowbrook Plantation no longer hummed with the quiet efficiency of a man in control. Every corner of the mansion seemed to whisper against Aldrich, each servant, each ledger, each delivery conspiring to remind him that his empire was no longer his own. Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle had entered his world like shadows, leaving traces too subtle to confront directly, yet powerful enough to bend reality to their will. Every small misstep, every delayed payment, every doubt planted in Aldrich's mind was meticulously calculated, a psychological cage tightening around him. Aldrich began noticing anomalies he could not explain. A shipment of cotton arrived short, not missing pieces but miscounted bales. Letters from bankers hinted at discrepancies in accounts he was certain were correct. Even casual conversations with plantation overseers began to feel like interrogation, each answer carefully weighed against his growing paranoia. He started questioning everyone, friends, employees, even Celeste, though he could not pinpoint why. The poison of suspicion, slow and invisible, had begun to seep into his veins. Celeste played her role with perfect subtlety. To Aldrich, she was still the obedient cook, the prize in a grotesque bet, the object of his dominance. But she had observed every detail of his routines, every secret indulgence, every lapse in judgment. She understood the rhythms of his fear and arrogance, and silently, almost imperceptibly, she began guiding him, not with commands, but with suggestions cloaked as necessity. A word here, a delay there, a glance of caution, enough to manipulate his decisions without revealing her awareness. Philippe and Henri escalated carefully. Philippe's charm at social gatherings painted Aldrich as increasingly isolated, subtly questioning the loyalty of his friends without ever revealing the true threat. Henry's manipulations of financial channels made Aldrich feel as though unseen forces were conspiring against him. Though all the moves were deliberate, measured, and entirely human. They did not attack openly. They attacked the very foundation of trust Aldrich had relied upon. The lesson becomes clear. Domination through fear is brittle. Those who act in quiet patience, with intelligence and precision, can dismantle an empire without ever firing a shot. Aldrich, drunk on his own arrogance, remained blind to the inevitability creeping toward him. And soon, the psychological siege would transform into a tangible confrontation, a reckoning that would force him to realize the depth of his vulnerability and the true cost of his cruelty. The first direct strike came quietly, almost imperceptibly, on a humid Alabama afternoon. Aldrich, convinced of his invulnerability, walked through the gates of Willowbrook with the same confident swagger he had cultivated for years. But the plantation itself had become a stage, every detail orchestrated by Philippe and Henri. A misplaced ledger, a suspiciously altered delivery manifest, a subtle hint from an overseer that a key shipment had been delayed. Each small act was a thread, unraveling the fabric of his control. Aldrich's paranoia began to swell. He questioned his staff more aggressively, demanded explanations for trivial discrepancies, and lashed out at those closest to him. Yet each accusation, each outburst, played directly into the hands of the conspirators. Philippe's subtle manipulations ensured that every corner Aldrich turned seemed filled with deceit. Henry's financial machinations created the illusion that his fortune was eroding, that debts were mounting, that the stability he had so carefully built was now slipping through his fingers. The plantation, once a symbol of his power, had become a mirror reflecting his growing impotence. Celeste, observing with a cold patience, acted as a silent accomplice without ever speaking. She controlled what Aldrich saw and what he could trust. A missed meal, a hidden note, a casually forgotten errand. Each small, deliberate act reinforced the sense of instability. Aldrich, too consumed with fear and suspicion, failed to notice the invisible web being spun around him. Philippe and Henry's approach was surgical. They avoided confrontation, understanding that a frontal attack would be met with violence. Instead, they exploited weaknesses in his personality, arrogance, greed, and the illusion of control. Aldrich had the illusion of control that had defined Willowbrook Plantation for years was dissolving, replaced by a creeping, gnawing uncertainty that clawed at his mind. Aldrich's paranoia escalated in tandem with his financial instability. He began inspecting every corner of the plantation himself, pacing through the fields with a restless intensity, scrutinizing every ledger, every tally, every delivery manifest. He questioned his overseers relentlessly, sometimes publicly, sometimes in private. His reputation as a commanding figure of authority was eroding before his own eyes. Those who once feared him began whispering in corners, sensing his unraveling, yet afraid to act, until the moment had been perfectly set. Philippe and Henri orchestrated these missteps with precision. Philippe, attending social gatherings and business meetings, planted subtle suggestions of distrust among Aldrich's allies, isolating him from friends and partners who had once legitimized his power. Henri, exploiting his understanding of financial networks, manipulated accounts, diverted funds, and ensured that every investment Aldrich made appeared to fail. The plantation owner, ever blinded by his own ego, failed to see the invisible hands guiding his ruin. Every miscalculation, every act of desperation further tightened the noose around him. Celeste's role became increasingly pivotal. Outwardly obedient, she silently observed the chaos she had helped cultivate, timing each subtle intervention to exacerbate Aldrich's fear and doubt. A misplaced utensil, a carefully delayed report, a casual comment meant to provoke suspicion. She did not act openly, but her influence was absolute. Aldrich, trapped in his own hubris, could not recognize that those closest to him were instruments of a larger, meticulously designed plan for retribution. This is the moment when a man begins to realize that true vulnerability does not come from external threats alone, but from the erosion of trust within his own sphere. Aldrich's downfall is not immediate, but inevitable, for patience, intelligence, and precision are far deadlier than impulsive violence. The first tangible strike against Aldrich came in the quiet of early November, under the guise of routine business. A shipment of cotton, meticulously prepared and counted by his overseers, was lost during transport. To Aldrich, it seemed like a minor inconvenience, an unfortunate accident. But Philippe and Henri had orchestrated it with intent. Every crate, every bale accounted for on paper, yet deliberately rerouted, intercepted, and delayed. The plantation owner, blinded by his growing paranoia, immediately suspected incompetence, not conspiracy. His rage, carefully anticipated by the conspirators, flared. He demanded explanations, reprimanded his staff, and made impulsive decisions that would further destabilize his own operations. This loss was more than financial, it was psychological. Aldrich's obsession with control, honed over decades, could not tolerate uncertainty. Each accident began to chip away at his confidence, creating a sense of instability that he could neither fully understand nor contain. Philippe's subtle manipulations at social events reinforced the narrative. Aldrich's empire was faltering, and whispers of mismanagement spread among those who had once respected or feared him. Even minor mistakes were magnified, giving the impression that Willowbrook was unraveling from within. Meanwhile, Henri systematically infiltrated the financial veins of Aldrich's holdings. Ledgers that had once appeared unassailable were now riddled with discrepancies he planted, disguised as routine clerical errors. Bank transactions were subtly altered. Investments that promised profit were engineered to fail. Every step of the way, Aldrich's actions, his panic, his overreactions, played directly into the conspirators' plan. What seemed like bad luck was actually the invisible hand of revenge, precise and methodical. Celeste, silent and composed, became the anchor of this psychological assault. She did not act violently. She did not confront him openly. Instead, she controlled information, restricted access, and used Aldrich's own expectations against him. A delayed message, a forgotten errand, a veiled warning about a supposed betrayal. These small interventions were enough to destabilize the plantation owner's mind further. Every instinct he relied on to maintain dominance now betrayed him, leaving him vulnerable to the more sophisticated, unseen forces at work. Here, the lesson is stark. True power is not brute force, but patience observation, and precision. Aldrich had relied on intimidation and cruelty. Philippe and Henri relied on calculation and time. And as the first seeds of ruin take hold, the plantation that once symbolized dominance becomes a prison of fear, uncertainty, and slow, inexorable decay. By December, Aldrich's paranoia had evolved into desperation. The cotton shipment had not been the only blow. Other ventures began to unravel with unnerving precision. Creditors, previously silent or deferential, now demanded payments, citing minor technicalities and obscure clauses in contracts that Henri had carefully manipulated. Every attempt Aldrich made to regain control only widened the cracks, exposing the fragility of the empire he had built on violence and greed. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of true vulnerability, not just financial, but existential. Aldrich's personal relationships began to fracture under the pressure. Overseers who had once obeyed without question now hesitated, whispering in corners, their loyalty eroding under subtle nudges planted by Philippe. His neighbors, once deferential, began to notice missteps and strange occurrences at Willowbrook Plantation, gossiping quietly at gatherings. The illusion of invincibility that Aldrich had maintained for over a decade was now collapsing under the combined weight of calculated sabotage and meticulously timed deception. Philippe and Henri were relentless, yet invisible. Every move Aldrich made was anticipated, every reaction predicted. Henri manipulated the flow of information, creating the perception of betrayal and incompetence among Aldrich's allies. Philippe's social engineering ensured that every whisper, every cautious glance, reinforced the narrative. The plantation owner was faltering, alone, and increasingly unhinged. Celeste's subtle interventions continued to escalate the tension, each small omission or delayed action pushing Aldrich further toward irrational decisions. It was during one particularly frigid morning, as Aldrich reviewed the plantation's ledgers, that he first realized something fundamental. He could not trust reality. Numbers did not add up, reports conflicted, and evidence seemed deliberately misleading. He began to question everyone, even Celeste, who maintained her outward compliance with an unsettling calm. This realization marked a turning point. The man who once manipulated life and death at Willowbrook was now ensnared in a psychological trap, unable to distinguish genuine threats from carefully orchestrated illusions. Here, the pattern becomes clear. The most dangerous power is patience applied with precision. Aldrich's downfall is not the result of sudden violence, but of a slow, inexorable unraveling orchestrated by minds who understood the subtlety of fear, manipulation, and control. Every misstep, every overreaction, only tightens the conspirator's grip, proving that dominance without awareness is always temporary. By the turn of a new year, Aldrich's sense of control had become a fragile illusion, shattered by the invisible hands guiding his every move. It began subtly at first. A missing ledger here, a delayed shipment there, but the pattern was undeniable. Each incident was designed to provoke a reaction, to force him into decisions that appeared logical but were, in reality, traps meticulously set by Philippe and Henri. Aldrich, the man who had orchestrated murder and betrayal with cold precision, was now ensnared in a web of manipulation so sophisticated that his own instincts, honed over years of cruelty, failed him. Aldrich's anger became a tool for the conspirators. Every outburst, every threat, every desperate gamble played directly into their hands. When he accused his overseers of incompetence or punished those who failed him in minor ways, Philippe ensured that the evidence of mismanagement seemed credible. Henri, behind the scenes, redirected funds, intercepted communications, and planted financial irregularities, creating the illusion that Aldrich's wealth and influence were slipping through his fingers. What had once been a fortress of power was now a labyrinth of uncertainty, each turn designed to weaken the man who had never faced consequences he could not buy or intimidate away. The psychological assault intensified as the conspirators targeted Aldrich's pride. Invitations to social gatherings were subtly manipulated. Prominent figures feigned casual disregard or veiled criticism, eroding the aura of respect and dominance Aldrich had cultivated. Celeste, silent and observant, played her part by controlling information and withholding opportunities for him to assert authority. Each interaction left Aldrich questioning his judgment, doubting his allies, and fearing betrayal at every turn. It was during this period of mounting pressure that Aldrich began to make reckless decisions, betraying the very strategies that had made him formidable. He gambled heavily, invested in risky ventures, and confronted supposed traitors with escalating violence. Moves that were all anticipated, calculated, and exploited by Philippe and Henri. The plantation, once a symbol of control and wealth, became a mirror reflecting the unraveling of a man who had underestimated the patient, precise power of intelligence over brutality. This phase of the plan proves a harsh truth. Dominance built solely on fear and force is inherently fragile. True power lies in subtlety, patience, and the ability to see what others cannot. Aldrich had once ruled Willowbrook through terror and manipulation. But in this calculated campaign of revenge, he was learning the same lesson the conspirators had mastered. The mind, once ensnared, could be more devastatingly vulnerable than the body. By early spring, the grip of Philippe and Henri tightened with an almost invisible precision. Aldrich no longer trusted his own senses. Letters that once contained straightforward business instructions now arrived riddled with contradictions. Shipments were delayed or lost under circumstances he could not explain. Each disruption seemed random, yet each served a purpose: to erode confidence, to destabilize him slowly, surgically. A man who had once controlled life and death at Willowbrook now felt the creeping paralysis of uncertainty, unable to act decisively without fear of unseen consequences. Aldrich's paranoia became palpable. He scrutinized every interaction, every glance from his overseers, every casual word from Celeste. Yet, no matter how cautious he became, the conspirators anticipated him. Philippe, mastery of social manipulation ensured that whispers of incompetence or duplicity reached Aldrich through trusted channels. Henry's financial tampering created the illusion that the plantation's profits were disappearing, as though the earth itself were conspiring against him. The wealth Aldrich had stolen, hoarded, and defended with murder was slipping through his fingers, yet he could not pinpoint the cause. The architects of his destruction remained ghosts, unseen, untouchable. Isolation became Aldrich's reality. Former allies withdrew subtly, guided by suggestions planted by Philippe. Overseers hesitated, unsure whether to follow orders or safeguard themselves. The social hierarchy Aldrich had relied upon to maintain dominance crumbled. replaced by uncertainty and suspicion. He confronted individuals, demanded loyalty, and punished imagined betrayals, but each reaction only strengthened the conspirators' position. Every move Aldrich made, every threat he issued, was anticipated, recorded, and countered. He was trapped not by chains, but by a strategy so patient and precise that it rendered his violence impotent. This is the moment when the psychological grip transforms into total control. Aldrich, who had once wielded absolute power through intimidation and cunning, was now learning the cruelest lesson of all. Fear can be redirected. The hunter becomes prey when those who understand the mind's fragility exploit it systematically. Henri and Philippe had weaponized patience, precision, and foresight against a man who relied solely on impulsive dominance. The slow erosion of his empire mirrored the disintegration of his confidence, his judgment, and ultimately his identity. And now, for those watching closely, reflect. What does it mean to lose control over your own reality? Comment below twice the phrase Willowbrook will remember, not as a gesture, but as an acknowledgement that understanding power is the first step to wielding it. Engage with this truth, for it marks the line between those who are manipulated and those who master the game. Aldrich's downfall was no longer a question of if, but when. By this point, every element of Willowbrook had been turned against him. Henri had discovered that Aldrich's debts were far deeper than anyone suspected, hidden beneath layers of false ledgers, manipulated accounts, and shell companies. Each profit Aldrich counted on was an illusion, a carefully constructed trap that made him overconfident, reckless, and blind to the forces orchestrating his demise. The plantation's revenue streams, once a source of pride, had become a maze of liabilities he could not navigate, a maze designed by men who understood both money and human nature. Philippe, operating in the shadows, infiltrated the very social structures Aldrich had relied upon to assert power. Gentlemen's clubs, political gatherings, and local councils became theaters of subtle humiliation. Words were twisted, reputations subtly undermined, and influence slowly siphoned from the man who believed he ruled all. Aldrich, obsessed with appearances and control, could not see the invisible hands dismantling his empire because he had never understood patience or strategic subtlety. Every insult, every rumor, every small misstep had been planned, mapped, and executed with meticulous precision. The genius of this campaign lay in its invisibility. Aldrich's worst fear had always been exposure, being caught, shamed, or challenged by someone with knowledge and power. And yet, he was now drowning in a carefully curated illusion. Everything seemed accidental, random, or the result of his own mistakes. Henri manipulated finances with quiet cruelty, redirecting funds, falsifying documents, and creating crises Aldrich could not anticipate. Philippe manipulated people, sowing doubt, fear, and suspicion, ensuring that even his closest allies questioned his judgment. Aldrich was isolated not by walls or chains, but by perception, a trap so elegant it was invisible to the man inside it. Every gamble Aldrich took to regain control only tightened the noose. He doubled down on risky investments, attempted to manipulate social interactions, and lashed out at perceived threats, all while the conspirators silently observed, recording, and exploiting each misstep. The lesson here is brutal and clear. True power is not in intimidation or violence. It is in foresight, patience, and the ability to shape reality without ever being seen. Aldrich had ruled through fear and impulse, and that weakness was now his undoing. By the time he realized he was trapped, it was already too late. The conspirators had transformed his own traits, greed, pride, and obsession with control, into weapons against him. By the summer of 1846, Aldrich's empire teetered on the edge of collapse. The plantation, once a symbol of his ruthless ambition, had become a theater of his failures. Henri and Philippe had synchronized their efforts with chilling precision. Shipments went missing, accounts were frozen, and trusted overseers suddenly became unreliable or vanished entirely. Each accident was a calculated strike designed to erode both resources and confidence. Aldrich's world, built on domination and fear, began to crumble not from external enemies, but from the unseen hands of men who understood the subtle architecture of revenge. Aldrich's compulsive gambling, once a minor indulgence, has now become a liability of devastating magnitude. Henri manipulated information about debts, wagers, and horse races, ensuring that every bet drained the plantation's coffers further. Each loss reinforced Aldrich's sense of invincibility, the very arrogance that Henri relied upon to manipulate him deeper into ruin. Meanwhile, Philippe orchestrated social humiliations, subtle yet devastating. Friends and associates began to doubt him. Alliances fractured, and whispers of incompetence spread through the circles Aldrich had once dominated. A man who had thought himself untouchable now found himself isolated, disbelieved, and subtly mocked. This was psychological warfare in its purest form. The conspirators did not need violence. Aldrich's own flaws, greed, pride, and obsession with control did the work for them. Henry's financial manipulations created a labyrinth of confusion, while Philippe's social engineering ensured that every interaction became a trap. Aldrich lashed out, attempting to reclaim control through intimidation and threats, but every reaction was anticipated, every move countered. The hunter had become the hunted, ensnared by forces he could neither see nor understand. Here, the lesson is clear for anyone who seeks power. Control is an illusion unless it is maintained through intelligence, patience, and a deep understanding of human psychology. Aldrich had dominated through brute force and fear, but he underestimated the subtle power of strategy and patience. By the time he realized the full extent of his vulnerability, it was already too late. Henri and Philippe had engineered a system in which every decision Aldrich made, every risk he took, led only to his further undoing. And now, take a moment and reflect. Type in the comments twice the phrase, "The river remembers Willowbrook." Let's sink in. Engagement here is not trivial. It is symbolic, a recognition that awareness of hidden forces is the first step to mastering them. By late 1846, the noose around Aldrich had tightened to the point where every breath he took felt weighted with inevitability. Henri and Philippe moved with quiet precision, their actions invisible but omnipresent. Every financial transaction Aldrich attempted was intercepted, every potential alliance corrupted before it could take root. The man who had once manipulated life and death on Willowbrook Plantation now found himself a puppet, dancing to rhythms he could not hear. His wealth, his power, his influence, all carefully stripped away through a strategy so subtle it appeared accidental to the untrained eye. Aldrich's panic grew. Yet he remained predictable. He turned to desperate measures, mortgaging property, calling in favors, and leveraging relationships that were already poisoned by Philippe's social manipulation. Every choice he made played directly into the conspirators' hands. Henri had traced every vulnerability, every dependency, every weakness in Aldrich's financial empire, while Philippe had planted seeds of mistrust that blossomed into paranoia, isolating the plantation owner from those who might have helped him. By the time Aldrich realized he had no allies, it was too late to recover. This is where true mastery of power becomes clear. It is not in visible force, but in shaping outcomes without confrontation. Henri and Philippe had constructed a system in which Aldrich's own actions, greed, pride, impulsiveness, became weapons against him. The psychological torment was relentless. Each night, Aldrich lay awake, haunted by rumors, debts, and losses, sensing danger, yet unable to identify its source. Every familiar face now carried the potential for betrayal. Every letter and ledger a coded message of doom. Fear, that primitive motivator, had become the instrument of his undoing. The brilliance of this orchestration is almost invisible. Aldrich's ruin was not immediate, not theatrical, but inevitable. It was built upon patience, foresight, and the exploitation of human weakness. One cannot underestimate the potency of a carefully executed plan. By controlling perception, shaping information, and predicting behavior, the conspirators made a violent confrontation unnecessary. Aldrich would destroy himself, believing that his failures were born of misfortune or his own errors, never realizing the invisible hands that guided him toward ruin. And now, reflect again. Comment twice on the phrase, "The river remembers Willowbrook," if you understand the lesson hidden in this historical trap. It is more than ritual, it is acknowledgement. Awareness of manipulation is the first step to mastering it. The final months of 1846 marked the inevitable collapse of Jeremiah Aldrich's world. What had begun as subtle manipulations by Henri and Philippe now converged into a crushing, unstoppable tide. Creditors demanded payment he could no longer provide. Overseers abandoned the plantation, taking both knowledge and loyalty with them. Rumors of financial impropriety, carefully seeded by Philippe, spread through Louisiana's elite social circles, isolating Aldrich from friends and allies. Every pillar of his empire, wealth, respect, authority, disintegrated under the relentless pressure of strategy, patience, and unseen calculation. Aldrich's desperation reached its zenith. He attempted to regain control through intimidation, threats, and bribes. But the men he had once ruled now saw only the hollow man behind the grand mansion. Henri had anticipated every move, intercepting finances, manipulating legal systems, and using Aldrich's own compulsions, gambling, pride, obsession, to engineer irreversible mistakes. Philip had turned society itself against him, so that even casual acquaintances doubted, whispered, and withdrew support. A man who once dictated terms now had nowhere to turn and nowhere to hide. By the winter of 1846, Aldrich was a shadow of the man who had married Celeste under a grotesque wager of power. The plantation was failing, his assets were frozen or lost, and his reputation lay in ruins. Yet what truly marked the finality of his undoing was the psychological torment. He lived every day in fear, aware that unseen eyes measured every decision, every breath, every heartbeat. The very fear he had once wielded against others now consumed him entirely. Henri and Philippe never struck a blow, never confronted him directly, and yet their revenge was complete, surgical, merciless, and invisible to anyone uninitiated in the architecture of power. This story, deeply disturbing as it is, carries a lesson far beyond the boundaries of 1850 Alabama. It reveals the mechanisms by which true power can be subverted, how knowledge and patience far outweigh brute force, and how the sins of arrogance and cruelty inevitably attract their own reckoning. Aldrich's downfall was not accidental. It was orchestrated by those who understood the art of manipulation, strategy, and the subtle application of invisible pressure. His story is a cautionary tale. Those who believe dominance is permanent are always blind to the forces quietly shaping their demise. So remember this: awareness of hidden systems, patience, and precision can destroy even the mightiest of men. Reflect on this, internalize it, and understand that history often hides its most dangerous lessons in plain sight. You have now seen how greed, cruelty, and arrogance can be used against the powerful themselves. Let this be your guide, your warning, and your awakening. The river remembers Willowbrook, and so should you. Even decades later, the story of Jeremiah Aldrich and Willowbrook Plantation did not fade. It lingered in whispers along the banks of the Alabama River, in the rustle of magnolia trees, in the creaking floorboards of abandoned slave quarters. Those who lived through it spoke of fear, secrecy, and a justice so hidden it seemed supernatural. The names Henri Rochelle and Philippe Deveau became legends, not because they killed, but because they taught the ultimate lesson: patience, intellect, and understanding human weakness are deadlier than any weapon. The mansion itself, once a symbol of Aldrich's pride, became a relic of moral corruption. Portraits of ancestors he never knew stared blankly from the walls, their eyes witnessing the collapse of a man who thought himself untouchable. Local folklore tells of shadows moving in the hallways at night, of whispered threats carried by the river breeze, as if the land itself remembered the treachery, greed, and vengeance that played out on its soil. Even historians who studied the region avoided the story, intimidated by its darkness, unsettled by its precision, and disturbed by the invisible threads of power that bound its events together. Here, at the edge of memory and myth, lies the true horror of Willowbrook. That evil, once unleashed, is never confined. It spirals, attracts attention, and eventually consumes those who wield it blindly. Aldrich's downfall demonstrates a timeless truth. The powerful are never invincible, and those who underestimate patience, intelligence, and psychological strategy will inevitably be undone. Power without wisdom is not strength. It is a trap waiting to spring. And so the final lesson echoes. Every act of cruelty, every manipulation, every attempt to control another carries consequences, often unseen, often deferred, but always inevitable. Henri and Philippe acted not from vengeance alone, but from mastery, a meticulous orchestration of justice hidden beneath the guise of chance. Aldrich's life ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with slow decay, mental torment, and the silent collapse of everything he valued. Look closely at history because it is not random. It is a web of action and reaction, cause and consequence, visible only to those willing to study it carefully. The story of Willowbrook is more than a tale of betrayal and revenge. It is a blueprint, a warning, a lesson in power, strategy, and human nature. The river remembers Willowbrook. You now do too. Guard this knowledge. Use it. Never forget that the shadows of history move silently, shaping destinies, waiting for the careless to fall. Your descent into the forbidden has ended here, but the understanding you carry changes everything. From greed and cruelty, wisdom and mastery are born. The lesson is yours.